Moving on, we now have a talk from Chris Jansen, who's a market advisor in Nokia's Network Information Infrastructure Group. He follows trends in optical networking and security technologies and their application to enterprise and other network operators. He has long contributed to the communications equipment and semiconductor fields through engineering and marketing roles. Chris enjoys giving back to the community through teaching engineering courses and serving on volunteer boards. Meanwhile, in between that, he can be found riding bikes or windsurfing on Cape Cod and Maui. Chris, welcome. We went there, and there's the time of which you'll go to Orange Women.
Okay, very good.
Just on the front.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I didn't know you were going to read that last little bit too, but how about that? Kind of forgot when I wrote that. But anyway, again, my name's Chris Jansen. Thanks for coming this morning. And among other things, my work at Nokia, especially over the last 2 years, has centered largely on this whole issue of quantum computers, emerging quantum computers, and what does that mean with respect to keeping data safe across data networks or telecom networks, in general networks. So my objective, aside from making the slide advance, my hope here in the next few minutes, if you've seen me give a talk like this in another conference, I hope it isn't entirely redundant, because guess what? Especially this past year, myself and a number of my colleagues have been literally flying around the world trying to just raise awareness of this topic. And it's really heated up, I would say, especially earlier in this year. So if you have heard this talk, I hope there's a few nuggets in here that you find new or interesting, because the whole idea of what we now have come to call quantum safe networks is changing very rapidly. So even within the last 2 weeks, there's a little situation I'll bring in somewhere in the talk here that's interesting. And then just a few months ago, there were some new standards that have come about. So this all changes the environment, the ecosystem, and it's the bottom line of all this, by the way, which I'll come back to a few times, is there's no one simple fix for this, right? This is a changing situation. So let's talk about what we mean by the threat. Before I even do that, guess what? As you first start to poke into this topic a lot, like so many things, there's all these acronyms that come up, and there's a love, especially for the Q in this quantum mix. Quantum this, quantum this. What's a good quantum? What's a bad quantum? Before we quantum safe? Is it post-quantum? So it can very easily become confusing. So I hope we can make a little bit of sense of all of this alphabet soup. So first thing, really, quantum computers, how real are they? What's the downside? In my various travels, and sometimes even candidly myself, when I'm thinking about or reading about quantum computers, because guess what, I'm not a physicist, I just wonder, how real are these things, and will they ever be, usable, practical? So I run into people often who are going to come up and say, you're never going to see a quantum computer that can do anything in your lifetime. We'll both be dead before these things are real. And that may be true, or it may not be true. And which side do you want to pick? So I've been, again, I'm not a physicist, but I do attend a lot of conferences, and I found at the supercomputing conference last year, I found it really interesting going to some talks that, admittedly are way over my head, but I'm hearing these physicists talking about advances in things like error correction and correlation and things, and they're really making pretty steady advances. And we like to think about quantum computers as from the good side. Let's start there anyway. What is the thing, and what does it really do? But basically this idea of a machine that can perform massive calculations using the state of a particle, using maybe the state of a photon or something like that, and just this idea of something that we call a qubit, a fundamental unit of computation now that's in multiple states at one time. It's something that's really counterintuitive, I think, and hard to get one's head around. So maybe you've seen this analogy, maybe you've not. I like it, and then if you poke around a bit on YouTube, you're going to find some critics of it. But I like this little idea of using a maze, and somewhat famous, maybe popular physicist, Michio, I think is his first name, Kaku, kind of describes it as this, the capability of, or draws an analogy to the capability of finding the path out of a maze as opposed to in single calculations, right? If we try to find our way out of a maze, we kind of take one path, find a dead end, and go on to the next one. But rather being able to perform all these possibilities at the same time and find the green line, instantaneously. That's just basically the fundamental notion here. So massively different, massively powerful, and well, why are we really doing this? What's really driving this? Some of it is, we'll drop down to the last bullet. Some of it certainly is basic curiosity and research, and that's just human nature. We'll continue to poke at these things, but just the idea of continuing to reach computational speed at higher levels, and then also more complex problems, right? We'd like to point to material research. That's one that's really driven some of this development, drug discovery, human genetics, and so forth. And then we can even plunk on top of that the idea of artificial intelligence. So imagine now this massive and different kind of computer executing artificial intelligence. It's interesting, a little bit scary, but this is where we're going to. And then the downside of this, I have to, as a real quick side, anecdote. Second year in a row now, last month, went to a thing called Quantum World Congress. And so it's all these quantum people and everyone's all excited about the first 3 bullet points. And then I come in there and I'm kind of like the bad guy, not bad guy, but the downer saying, well, what does it mean for information security? A really powerful computer, perhaps executing AI, now looking at the way that we protect information flying across a network. That's the downside, and that's sort of the bummer. All right, so where's it at, really? How real are these things? How real is a quantum computer? Is anyone here from IBM? You don't have to raise your hand, but I'm not going to pick on IBM. In fact, I'm using IBM as a good example of how these things are advancing. So what I'm showing on this picture here, first of all, not only are companies and countries, so we have both public and private funding, both putting billions of dollars into developing quantum computers. And I already mentioned progress shown at supercomputing, but look at what IBM's doing with respect to the development of their processors, which have now got a clear visibility using this. First of all, and I just put a picture in here, and they're 133 qubit processor, but now assembling a modular architecture that goes out to 100,000 qubits in the not too distant future, and this is what they call their BlueJay system. So they've got a clear roadmap to that. And they announced this thing called their System 2 back in December of last year. So, the point is that IBM is making clear progress towards what one might call a practical computer, quantum computer. But now, again, some of you might be saying, well, how many qubits do you need to break RSA 2048? We don't know yet. We'll go into that a little bit more. But before we even get there, what's the downside, really? The downside is that there is a nervousness, there is a threat, a vulnerability that a practical quantum computer, sometimes called a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, will be able to break into things we've done for decades to protect networks. And so that's the fundamental vulnerability or the fundamental starting point with respect to what we call building quantum safe networks. So let's get into some of the technicalities here. When we look at, if I just say cryptography and how we might protect data in a network, different standards might pop into your mind depending on your experience with this stuff. But fundamentally, I like to think of it in terms of 3 aspects. I'll probably have a picture to back this up in a minute, but the idea of how we lock down data going across the network, and then we fundamentally use keys to either do that locking or unlocking mechanism. And then there has to be a way to get that key to either end of the communication channel. So when we mention here asymmetric crypto or symmetric crypto, these are a reference really to how that key actually gets to either end of a link. So let's talk about symmetric cryptography first. So this is the idea, sometimes also called pre-shared keys, where if I'm trying to get some data from me to you out there, I have a communication channel, probably an optical link as an example. Let's go down to layer 1 in the OSI reference model. And I have a lock now commonly using something called AES, Advanced Encryption Standard. It's just a mechanism for taking blocks of data and encrypting it. But now I have to get a key in one way or another. We have to share some key or use some key to both for me to do the locking and you to do the unlocking on the other end. So that's the idea of key distribution. Now, for what we call pre-shared keys, there's a couple of ways to do this. One way I annotate manual here, that might be the idea that before I'm even going to communicate anything to you, we'll call it an armed guard comes up and gives me a key in some digital means, and then they also go around to the other end and give you that key on that other end before any communication starts. So you've got some sort of pre-shared piece of information that's going to say, okay, I recognize this, and then I'm going to use that key to encrypt, and you're going to use it to decrypt. So it's a very secure method of key distribution. When we say automation, that's just saying taking that person out of the way and actually using some automated platform to perform that function. Okay, then a little bit of an aside here. Well, I've thrown in quantum key distribution. What the heck is that? That's the first, bit of alphabet soup I've thrown at you. This is the idea of instead of using a random number generator just based on some, say, like a noise source or some sort of classic physics, instead we're going to use a quantum method. It's a different use of that word quantum, but now we're going to use a quantum method to generate an extremely random key such that if someone else actually interrupts that or gets in the way of that key generation, it goes kaput, right? It doesn't, it cannot be compromised. And so that ability to encrypt and decrypt is lost. We'll come back to QKD in a minute, but that's another mechanism of creating a key, which is then distributed symmetrically. So everything I've shown on here so far is very, very safe and is what's deemed to be quantum safe. Well, let's back up from that for a second, because you might imagine all those things I just described are a little complex, right? Having that person, and I'm not exaggerating in some cases, where you physically have an armed guard deliver a key from one end to the other, or an automated platform that implies some things about communication between two sides. So that doesn't scale very well. So this is why protocols that distribute using what's commonly called public key infrastructure, PKI, another acronym, to then use standards or protocols such as RSA or Diffie-Hellman or elliptic curve to actually distribute the key again from me to you. So that this is now asymmetric distribution, because I actually take that little bit of knowledge or that little piece of information, I encrypt the key along with the data and then send it over to the other side. And then you over there now trying to decrypt, you have that little piece of knowledge, and then you compute the key, which then gets used for decryption. So this asymmetric notion is nice from the standpoint of being able to replicate it many, many, many times. Well, that's been fine up until now with respect to the commonality of even very powerful classic or binary type computers around. In other words, things like algorithms like RSA, especially RSA 2048, now I'm implying the key length, are deemed to be very, very safe from attack from a classic computer. However, there's just a few more points on the slide. It gets a little dense here, but that's okay. However, in the face of a quantum computer now, and there's some mathematical proofs or algorithms that prove what I'm going to say here, symmetric crypto is deemed to be safe because that key has been removed from the data path, for one, and the idea that actually trying to brute force the number of possibilities of a key, especially in the case of a 256-bit key length, would take an extraordinarily long amount of time. So that's on the one side. And on the other side, using that same kind of logic, the idea is that in the presence of a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, Shor's algorithm now tells us that asymmetric crypto is broken. So these two algorithms, Shor's on the right here, and then Grover's on the left, give us sort of the there's two kind of stakes in the ground with respect to use of different encryption mechanisms and different key distribution mechanisms to keep data safe. So as you start to hear different people talk about what quantum safe means, I think it's really essential to look for, again, keys, locks, distribution, but especially that distribution piece. Okay, so let's just think a little bit about some network security basics here, just to, if all this is a little unfamiliar to you, I put this in here just as a way to kind of develop a bit of a construct with respect to how we might keep data safe. What we are fundamentally talking about here in the face of our classic computer is that cryptography in general gives us a very powerful set of tools to contain these three different types of risks that we might have. Someone eavesdropping, just sitting there, tapping into, let's say, a fiber network, collecting data, looking for maybe system commands or something, or login information. Maybe they then use that to perform some kind of a denial of service attack or something like that. Perhaps they're stealing data which might be used later to just create some financial mayhem, steal money out of an account or something of that sort. And then also just this idea of a man-in-the-middle attack, where you might actually compromise the integrity of data that's flying across the network. To date, again, in the face of a classic computer and using either asymmetric or symmetric cryptography, we've been safe. But now what I'm saying to you is that going into the future, at some point, there's a set of threats here that we now need to consider, which could attack and could compromise things like RSA 2048, could compromise elliptic curve mechanisms and other asymmetric ciphers. Okay, so now with all that in mind, a common question is sort of why act now? If I've said, and some have said to me, and maybe some of you will say to me, I don't believe there'll be a cryptographically relevant quantum computer in our lifetime. Why do anything now? And how many qubits does it take to create one of these things? And I can't give you a solid answer. Why do anything? Well, first of all, again, it's a rapidly changing landscape. Secondly, don't be overconfident or too naive in the way the world is. But there's also this idea of what's called a harvest now, decrypt later attack. So much like the eavesdropping situation we outlined a minute ago, it's believed, in fact, I've heard from pretty good sources, some large Western governments firmly believe this is happening right now, where bad state actors have tapped into different fiber networks and are just sitting there collecting encrypted data with the asymmetrically enciphered encrypted data, with the idea that at some point in the future they'll be able to break that. So that's a reason to kind of think about this now and act now. All right, so to put some statistics on that, this is a chart we use quite a bit from the Global Risk Institute. They put together a thing that they call a quantum threat timeline report every year. I think the next one is due in either next month or December. But think about this for a second. Okay, it's a year old, but imagine projecting forward only to 2033. What they put together, and these are people who think about these risks and evaluate these risks quite routinely. In fact, as a sideline, the Global Risk Institute is actually based, I believe, here in Toronto, but it was funded, I know, by the Canadian government, the Ontario government, as well as a set of financial operators in the area. But anyway, these are people who really are keenly interested in risk. And so what they've computed is that by 2033, so 9 years from now, there's somewhere between a 17 and 31% chance that there will be a cryptographically relevant quantum computer powerful enough to break RSA 2048. So that's kind of robust. Now you might be saying, well, that also means there's a 69% chance that there won't be a cryptographically relevant quantum computer by then. But look at it this way: if I'm told with relatively strong confidence that in 10 years from now or 9 years from now that my house is going to burn down, I'm going to do something now. I'm going to act now. I might change the batteries in my smoke detector and keep the portable heaters away from the curtains and so forth. So I think that's pretty compelling to say to anyone operating a network that you ought to at least be thinking about this now and taking some actions. Okay, well, guess what? You're thinking, well, this guy works for Nokia. They make equipment, so of course he's going to say that. But this is not a Nokia-centric thing, I got to tell you. By any means, or any vendor, any equipment manufacturer, by any means. As a slight aside, my interest in a small set office in Nokia became interested in this about 9 years ago, shortly after the US NIST made a recommendation about what networks ought to be doing with respect to keeping top secret data safe, and that was actually going to an asymmetric key distribution mechanism, and that made us take notice. And for a while there, frankly, we kind of ignored it. And then about 2 years ago, some of our customers started to look at some of these examples of things that are going on now. Just point to one or two of them. The European Union in particular is pretty interesting with respect to the amount of money they're putting into what they call their Euro QCI initiative. And that's led to some trials and things, and fair amount of money being put into actually taking actions today to protect critical infrastructure network operators. So, okay, you get it. It's a threat. What do we do now? And are you telling me we need to tear out networks and fundamentally reconstruct? It's not that bad. First of all, what I hope you're taking away is that you want to do something. You want to do something now. You want to look at, first of all, are you doing anything in some cases? And I don't say that to sound sarcastic, but I know we have some customers that have completely unprotected data in some places, unencrypted. It's just kind of the way things have evolved. But really look for how keys are distributed. Look for which ciphers might be in use across your network. Is it an asymmetric public key cipher? Is it a symmetric pre-shared key cipher? So a bit on that, a bit more on that, I should say. Public key cryptography here. Again, here's the idea. If you didn't I tried to elucidate this a bit, but here's just a little bit more of an illustration with respect to public key cryptography. We always use the construction of Alice and Bob communicating to each other, right? And Alice has a private key, and Bob has a private key. And first Alice sends her public key to Bob, and Bob sends his public key across to Alice. And that was fine in the face of a classic computer, but now with the CRQC, the trouble is there may be someone listening, and maybe someone who is able to decrypt that, able to find that key and source it out. So that's bad. That's a vulnerability. Now on the other side, symmetric key cryptography, is that deemed to be deemed to be quantum safe? It actually is, and we can talk again about Shor's and Grover's algorithms. But here's what's happening there, right? So you have one secret key that's used to encrypt and decrypt. It comes from a central source, which again could be manual or automated. And so the vulnerability, because guess what? There's always a vulnerability somewhere. Never say never. There's always some risk to be thinking about. So the eavesdropping during that key distribution is possible, but it's deemed to be safe, especially if there's a complete disassociation of that key from the data plane. And so this is part of the real strength of symmetric key cryptography. So, okay, again, leading now into what makes a quantum safe network? Keys, locks, distribution. Right, so what's the ideal key? Well, the industry standard anyway now tends to be, I'm going to talk about symmetric distribution specifically, the advanced encryption standard AES, using a 256-bit length key. So that's part of the key. The other notion here is really, well, how is that key generated? And that key ought to be generated, needs to be generated from a truly random source that's not vulnerable. And on top of that, we want to do a rotation. We want to change it every now and then. So all these things lead towards or bring us to what is a high quality, very safe key. I want to just poke on something here a bit. I talked about true random numbers, and this is where the idea of quantum keys or quantum key distribution comes in, which you can learn more about. instead of using a classic physics-based source or random number generator, now again, instead we use, or could use, among other things, a state of a photon. And that gives us something that's really, really random, viewed to be, the ultimate randomness. So that's the idea of quantum key distribution, is not only that it's symmetric, but also that the randomness is extremely high, and also there is the idea that you have extreme strength with respect to its vulnerability to eavesdropping. All right, so that's the whole thing about keys. We've talked about distribution quite a bit. And then again, more unlocks. So when I hear RSA or AES, there's kind of an inference with respect to key distribution. But as those two things are just as examples, AES is what's called a block cipher. Uses a thing called substitution permutation with respect to how data is kind of shifted in and the key is applied. It's very robust. So depending on who you talk to, pretty reliable sources. AES has not been compromised, has not been a successful brute force attack on AES 256. And then you might be saying, well, why 256-bit length? Well, that again has been viewed as, for now, stake in the sand with respect to quantum safeness, because its length is long enough so that in the face of even a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, which will sit there or can sit there and try to brute force the key, the amount of time that would take is longer than the history of the planet. So it's viewed for now to be long enough. We'll see where things go over time. So the solution really, we believe is, I've been talking about all these different things here. How does one really form a quantum safe network? And we draw on here the OSI reference model from application down to physical layer. And I can tell you that as an aside, one time, probably 6-7 years ago, was before we called it quantum safe networks, I was talking to a customer at a trade show about performing encryption at the physical layer. And he said, well, does that mean I can remove my IPsec or MACsec from my data? And no, don't do that, right? If you have 2 locks on the door, leave them both there, maybe put a third on. So this idea of defense in depth is saying, yes, we want to perform protection, put protection mechanisms in up at the application layer, and we also probably want to put one in somewhere down below. Maybe it's down at the MPLS, maybe it's at the network layer, and then also at the physical layer as well. Now, how we actually apply these things, or what you actually do there, depends a bit on product evolution, what you've got deployed already, the sensitivity of the data that you have on the network, a whole host of factors. But the good news is, I think I got it in the next slide here. The good news is there's a lot of tools in the tool chest, things you could do without necessarily, not really implying a whole-scale reconstruction of the network. So in this picture, what I've tried to do is just illustrate, a model that's saying on the left here now, present mode, maybe you've got protections that are that could be at the network layer or down at the physical layer. Maybe you've got something up on the application layer as well, kind of a pre-PQC. Let's talk about PQC in a second, but the idea of a application layer or session protection that you've got in place. And that's viewed to be quantum safe. Now those bottom 3 layers that I have on this slide are HDNL vulnerable, meaning someone could be tapping into that, could be collecting that data and potentially breaking that in the future. If there's only one of those in place, then that's a high vulnerability. If you've got several in place, that's more safe. So what happens here over time? Okay, so first of all, let's talk about PQC, or post-quantum cryptography. These are mathematical protections that strive to solve the problem of asymmetric ciphers with respect to their vulnerability, yet without needing to go down to a symmetric distribution mechanism that is hard to scale up at the application layer. You need some kind of public key infrastructure in one way or another to protect that application layer. You're just not going to be able to do it using a symmetric mechanism up at those high layers. So there have emerged recently a set of post-quantum cryptography ciphers. And be careful, when you hear PQC, don't think that that replaces any of the things I've told you about the safety of symmetric key distribution, or the idea that you're safe from quantum attack with symmetric key distribution, especially down at the lower network layers. The idea of PQC, again, is trying to address that top layer. So, okay, we create these mathematical ciphers. There were a set of them that, using an example of US NIST, there were a set of them that went through a bit of a competition. And I'm kind of truncating the message here, a little bit of the story, I should say. In that one of them in the competition was broken like within a few days by, I think it was a teenager in Belgium or something like that. But the point is that there's vulnerabilities there. Again, this is a moving target. But PQC went through this set of trials, for lack of a better word, in a standardization process. And now we have a set of mathematical-based post-quantum ciphers that are available for use. And they are now starting to find their way, or will be, into various products that you'll be able to buy. So what we see happening over time, we see happening over time here is that we kind of switch over to quantum safe mode, meaning we protect things, in one example, from the bottom layer up, and then in time, those post-quantum ciphers will take action up at the top layer. And okay, so what does that mean with respect to where commercial products might be in a few years? I think, and it's just an opinion, these new NIST PQC ciphers will start to appear in different places, starting to come from the application layer down, and that will take a little bit of time. Okay, so I know there's a lot, this is a dense chart in a way, but this is just an example of how QSN, or quantum safe networks, might evolve over time. And what I'm trying to show here is sort of a set of possibilities, a set of those tools in the tool chest at work. The thing on the far left here, which we tend to call Blueprint 1, it's the idea of the security guard physically delivering a key to both ends of that, from Alice to Bob. And that's extremely robust, very safe. That is done now and is deemed to be quantum safe. Trouble again with that is it's hard to scale that. So there's a desire to automate in a lot of cases, that process. So that's where a type of server can be used, a very secure server, to create that key, distribute it out of band to both ends, and create a very nice, neat, symmetric distribution mechanism at layer 1, as an example. Then in the third case now, so what we have towards the right is use of quantum key distribution. This is very popular in Europe, so there's a little bit of regionality in terms of preference and why to do this. QKD was favored by the Euro QCI initiative, so there's a lot of money being put into it. And you can read about different proof of concept trials that have gone on, especially in the past year. So QKD, again, is this idea: you use a quantum source to generate that randomness of the key, the kind of essence, the DNA of that key. And then a requirement of that means that for Alice to talk to Bob, I need a dedicated fiber link, so it's a bit of a trouble. And there's distance limitations on that, which is a bit of a trouble. But again, it's extremely robust, it's extremely safe. But then that key is now pushed down, if you will, from those quantum sources down to the actual pieces of equipment that are sending the information over the fiber. So there's a little bit of complexity involved there, but again, it's sort of the idea of removing the key from the data plane. You have that nice symmetric symmetric architecture, and a highly random source. And then the last one, just to point to on this slide, is the idea of, instead of using a piece of fiber for that quantum link, there are distance limitations there, so we might want to use satellites. So if I have a secure link, let's say even from Toronto to New York, as an example, I can't do that quantum key transmission, or teleportation, as they call it, over an optical fiber very easily. It can actually use many, many 100-kilometer hops to make have that happen. But a neater way to do that actually is use a satellite. So you'll see that start to emerge over time. So just a bit more on key distribution and how this might actually work. Basically from the standpoint of everything I've described, I think fairly well here already. But what I want to just highlight is just the idea of automated pre-shared key distribution as an example is, again, having a server out there now that actually generates this key from a very random source, in this case, a classic physics-based source. However, ahead of time, I actually have to have pre-installed on each network element a key that's there at commissioning, which then allows me to then compute the green key that's on here, which then gets pushed out to both sides of the link, and then encryption actually occurs. So there's a process that's going on here with respect to actual distribution. Another sort of build out on that is what I was talking about with respect to quantum key distribution. Now, you might imagine that there's a number of vendors involved here. So, how does that happen? Because I was kind of describing this thing about a quantum link between the two, and now I've got the server, and how do we orchestrate all that stuff? There's a lot of work going on now amongst vendors. My only point in putting this in here is to point to that. There's a lot of work going on right now amongst vendors to make these things work well with each other. So some ETSI standards that define how that line where the pink key is on this chart from the QDN, the quantum distribution network, down to the network elements actually occurs. So generally speaking, there's a bit of a hybrid architecture that includes some aspects of classic key distribution, that nice symmetric architecture, and then quantum key distribution. Again, we're a bit more detail on this. How did I make that Toronto to New York hop work without using a satellite? The idea now is I can also use trusted nodes along the way, about every 100 kilometers or so. That gets a little bit messy, just with respect to how many hops that might take and the amount of cost involved. But again, I can use all those other points I talked to earlier to actually get that quantum key from let's say Toronto to New York through multiple hops, through multiple trusted nodes, and utilizing a trusted server, the little pink box at the bottom with the green guard standing there, to ultimately actually create finally the encrypted transmission. And let's see. I'm going to go on from here. This is just how the key actually, just an illustration here on how the key actually ends up being computed and then distributed to each end before the actual encryption occurs. Okay. Come on. Too many builds. Okay, and then the last piece finally is just replacing that with the satellite. This is an interesting technology that will emerge. I can share with you that companies like Honeywell or Thales are actively planning to shoot satellites up to actually perform this function. So the way this would work now is using my Toronto to New York example, is I have a line of sight. I need to have a line of sight path between here to the satellite. Well, okay, and I can actually generate a set of keys and then store them for a short period of time, and then allow me to do key rotations over time. So the limitation really is just about making that actual line of sight connection between ground to satellite. So all the other mechanisms for key distribution remain just as I showed a second ago in the trusted node example. Okay, so responding to the threat, really, again, the thing I want you to leave you with here is throwing all these different things at you. If you've been looking at this a while, it may be very much common speak to you. If not, it might be a little confusing. I hope that all of you, regardless of what type of network you might be operating, will at least look at this, pay attention to it. So this threat timeline, is it 5 years or 15 years until so-called Q-Day? We don't know. The other anecdote I wanted to put in front of you, if you haven't seen it already, just in the last 2 weeks, there was a report of a paper that was published from China some researchers in China. It was published on, I'm going to forget the name of the source right now, but it's in a few different media sources right now. It was also on TechTarget, I think. But anyway, the report was basically saying that that some folks in China were able to use what's called a quantum annealer, a small quantum computer, to break RSA. That was the headline. They've broken RSA. We have to be really careful about that. We've been looking at this and saying, well, is this credible or is it dubious? The trouble is that it may well be that RSA has been broken, but when you look in the fine print, you realize it was actually 22-bit RSA, so it's a very short key length. And the consensus seems to be among, not just me, but some of our researchers, our strong cryptographers in Bell Labs and other places that have said, guess what? You can break RSA 22 or RSA 50 even using a conventional computer. So it's really puzzling why this paper was written or why it came out. Maybe it's a source of just basically creating fear. I don't know. In many ways, I think it just kind of says, look, if RSA were even broken, even almost up to RSA 2048, it just reinforces everything I've been saying here, is that you need to act now. You need to do something. You need to create a plan anyway to actually respond to all this stuff. So, okay, I'm not going to go through each of these things, but here's a set of acronyms. I think I've thrown all of these at you in the last 30 minutes or so. So do some research, do some reading. When you hear about post-quantum cipher as an example, or PQC, just recognize that doesn't negate everything that guy at NANOG was talking about with respect to symmetric key distribution and all that. It kind of does all fit together. And I think I'll leave it there. I think I'm running out of time if I'm not over already. And thanks so much. Thanks for your attention. I really appreciate having me up here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris. We've got 1 minute for questions if anybody has a quick one.
Hi, Patrick Gilmore, unaffiliated. Quick question. On the passing of, you were saying over the fiber making truly random quantum stuff. What's the bandwidth of that? Like how many bits can you get over per second? Like is this a gigabit type thing? So you could do OTPs or something? Yeah.
It's very low speed.
Very low speed. Okay.
And the thing is, and I struggle with this too. If you go to one of these QKD people and talk to them about it, and ask a question like that, they'll say, well, it's not transmission, it's teleportation. And I'm like, what does that mean, right? Because we're used to switching a fiber laser on and off or something. But at the end of the day, it's very low speed.
Okay. I was just wondering if you could get enormous keys and do OTPs instead of...
And the limitation is more about losing that quantum state over a long distance in fiber. And so it's roughly 100-kilometer limitation. Right now, it's changing. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Very quick, please.
Yeah. Ryan Kozak, Charter Telecom. I actually wanted to ask about that distance limit. Is there some fundamental thing there, or can we see that like 10x, 100x over generations?
That's the hope, right? The hope is to get it to be a more practical distance. Now, we can talk about it in more detail later if you like, but as an example, there's an operator in Spain that's doing experimentation with hollow core fiber on that. So hollow core is kind of higher loss. So anyway, the point is really that there's research going on to try and lengthen that out, because that is a problem. And if we go to this multi-hop trusted node thing, it's kind of also impractical. So
thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chris.
Okay.